Here's your host, John, with more classic movie reviews.
Welcome to today's show. My name is John. As always, you can subscribe to the show on iTunes or follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes. You can also go to snarkymoviereviews.com to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Remember, this show is completely free and independent. All I ask is that you jump over to iTunes and give me a review. Today's movie is Tower of London, 1939. This movie was set in 15th century England. It has a great cast featuring Basil Rathbone, Boris Karloff, Vincent Price, and Barbara O'Neill. This movie was made by Universal at the same time RKO was making The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It was one of the hottest years on record in Hollywood, and the actors in full costume suffered immensely.
The actors.
Basil Rathbone played the role of Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He is bent on killing his way to the English throne. Rathbone was covered in Episode 9, Son of Frankenstein, 1944. Boris Karloff played Mord, the executioner. Karloff was covered in Episode 7, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. Barbara O'Neill was cast in the role of Queen Elizabeth with unusual spelling. O'Neill is known for playing Scarlett O'Hara's mother in Gone with the Wind, 1939, although she was only 28 at the time. Other important roles include The Nun Story, 1959, and Stella Dallas, 1937. Ian Hunter played the role of King Edward IV. Hunter was covered in Episode 80, The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938. Vincent Price played Clarence, Duke of Clarence. Price was covered in Episode 45, The Last Man on Earth, 1964.
Story.
In 1471, Edward IV, Ian Hunter, deposed the elderly Henry VI to become King of England. Edward's wife, Queen Elizabeth, Barbara O'Neill, is busy taking care of her 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl. The execution bell sounds, and Mord, Boris Karloff, is busy sharpening his axe as a giant raven sits upon his shoulder. As he leaves to conduct the execution, he casually stops to add more weight to a man being tortured. The club-footed executioner makes his way to the block where Lord de Vere is being executed. The old King Henry is being kept in the tower, and he wears a paper crown and seems to not be in touch with reality. In a lucid moment, the old king says his son, the Prince of Wales, will return with an army from his exile in France. Lady Alice Barton, Nan Gray, comes in to remind Elizabeth that they have to attend the execution. Lord Hastings comes in and finds King Edward fighting a practice match using halberds with his hunchback brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Basil Rathbone. Both Edward and Richard are champion fighters. Their effete half-brother, the Duke of Clarence, Vincent Price, looks on.
My dear Lord Chamberlain, the only way to learn to fight is to fight. Richard and I can take care of ourselves.
Edward, did you see Richard try to brain me?
No.
He didn't miss my head by more than an inch.
Clarence, he meant to miss. He didn't try to clip you. If he had tried...
John Wyatt is the cousin of the man being executed, and he says the man was betrayed by Richard. He asks the Queen for permission to stand on the block with his condemned kinsman. John and Alice are in love, and she feels that it will cause trouble for him. A chimney sweep and his child assistant are cleaning chimneys above the execution. De Vere gives a speech before the execution, and it puts John in an unfavorable light with the king. Mord removes the man's head with one stroke. Afterwards, Richard pays Mord £5, and Mord pledges his undying devotion to Richard.
Well, Mord, a true stroke if ever I saw one. I was proud of you. You're £5. I won the wager, but you earned it.
Your Highness, you're more than a duke. More than a king. You're a god to me.
Crookback and Dragfoot. Misfits, eh? Well, what we lack in physical perfection we make up here, eh?
After Mord leaves, Richard opens a locked cabinet where he has dolls of the king and everyone in line to be the king, ending with himself in 6th position. Old King Henry, the Prince of Wales, Edward's 2 sons, Clarence, and finally Richard. When he looks at the Prince of Wales doll, he says that the prince robbed him of the only woman he ever loved. Alice and John lament that the king won't give them permission to marry, and that they only stay for the Queen. The child sweep falls into the Queen's apartment where Alice and John are talking.
I skinned me arm. I didn't mean to do it, my lord.
Don't be angry with the poor child. He's hurt and frightened.
You should be more careful.
Oh, where is he? Where is he? Oh, praise be, he's all right. Me little helper. Was I worried? I thought he met an untimely end. The lad didn't mean nothing, my lady. It was me own fault.
It was an accident. Here's a shilling. Buy some salve for your elbow.
Thank you, but...
I'll see that he gets the best of care, my lady.
John goes to wait for the king to ask permission to marry Alice. Richard comes by and then goes in to see his brother, the king. The king wants Richard to marry an elderly woman who is rich and well-connected in the South. Clarence is already married to a rich woman. Richard says he only wants the wife of the Prince of Wales and blames Clarence for the marriage of Anne Neville. Richard concocts a plan to make John marry the elder woman. The king likes the idea, and they order John to marry the woman. John refuses, and the king has him delivered to Maud. The queen is angry with the king about imprisoning her cousin, John. The king agrees to exile John to France to calm his wife, the queen. About this time, they find out that the Prince of Wales has landed with an army. Richard comes up with a plan to take the old king into battle to fight his own son. Through Maud, Richard spreads the word that the old king has turned against his son and is working with the Edward side. Alice sends a note from the queen with a page to have John dropped ashore in England, but Maud intercepts the boy. The Prince of Wales has left his wife, Anne Neville, behind at a monastery. The two armies meet at a bridge near Tewkesbury, and the fight begins. The old king moves around the field without knowing what is going on, but he is not killed. Richard and the prince find each other on the field, and the prince is no match for Richard. Richard and King Edward are victorious. Clarence's wife is Anne's sister. They try to help her get out of the country, but fail. Since the old king did not die in the battle, Richard has Maud murder him as he is praying. Richard opens his cabinet and throws the old King Henry and the Prince of Wales dolls into the fire. He moves the 4 remaining figures up the line towards the king's throne. Maud finds where Anne is hiding, and Richard orders him to arrest her. She is taken to a cell, and Richard comes and pretends to rescue her. He says he will stand for her before the king.
£50 if you'll tell the Duke of Clarence I'm here.
There's only one person with influence enough to serve you, and that's the Duke of Gloucester.
Do I hear my name? What means this dark corner gossip about me with the serving wench? Anne. Anne, how come you here in this strange guise?
She's under arrest.
Who dared give such an order?
The king, your highness.
The king? Oh, Anne, someone has made a terrible mistake. If I'd only known it before. Appoint me to plead for you. I'll move heaven and earth to set you free. I'll risk everything to take you to the king. We must go together.
The king acts like he is enraged. The king says he will release her only if she marries Richard. Richard pretends that that is too much to ask, but Anne says she will willingly marry him. The next day, the king's youngest son, the Duke of York, is married to a royal child his own age. After the marriage, they announce the engagement of Richard and Anne. Clarence storms out, and later the king gives most of his father-in-law's wealth to Richard. Clarence threatens the king and begins talking treason to other lords. Maud's spies overhear, and Clarence is arrested. Richard goes to Clarence's cell, and then he tricks him into accepting a drinking contest. Clarence thinks he's got it made. They go to the cellar and start drinking. It seems to be the precursor of the Raiders of the Lost Ark drinking contest. Richard seems to pass out, and Clarence starts celebrating until Richard gets back up.
Someone! Thomas! I've won. Richard, you promised. You swine!
Maud comes in, and the two stuff Clarence into a vat of wine, staying true to his word that he would only use wine as a weapon. When the king is told that Clarence is dead, he says wait until the morning. Richard goes to his cabinet and removes the Clarence doll. Now all that remains between him and the throne are his two nephews. The years pass and it's 1483. John is in France with Henry Tudor. They reveal that the king is ill and they worry what Richard will do. Just before the king dies, he pardons John and says he and Alice can marry. He appoints Richard protector of his 2 sons until the oldest comes of age to be the king. In his cabinet, Richard moves the young Edward to the throne and moves himself 1 step closer to the chair. Richard does a good job helping the young king. He then has young Edward's brother, Richard, come to live in the tower. Elizabeth knows it is the wrong thing to do, but she cannot stop it from happening. When the young Richard arrives at the tower, young Edward is dueling with his uncle like his uncle and father used to. There is word in the city calling for the older Richard to be king. It comes from Mord and his gang. The mob comes to the tower and calls for old Richard to take the crown. He says he will need time to consider. John makes his way back to England and Alice. They meet with Elizabeth, and she asks John to help protect her sons. She wants him to steal the royal treasury and fund Henry Tudor's army to fight old Richard.
Henry Tudor and I have laid all plans for raising an army, but we can do nothing without money.
So far, Richard hasn't dared to appropriate the royal treasure, but I dare. John, you must steal the treasure from the tower. In the hands of Henry Tudor, it will serve as a weapon strong enough to overcome even Richard.
Elizabeth gives him the location, and they go in and retrieve the treasure. Mord is investigating and finds that only John has left the castle recently with a cart. Old Richard tells the council of the robbery and accuses Elizabeth as John is brought into the chamber wearing chains. Old Richard tries to bribe John to find the location of the treasure. Richard turns John over to Mord for a torture session. Mord throws the whole dungeon at John, but they can't break him. The abbey where Elizabeth is hiding is guarded by Richard's men. The priests make arrangements to have Alice smuggled out. Alice meets with the chimney sweep, and he sneaks Alice into the tower disguised as a helper. She is lowered into John's cell. She gives him a file and leaves a rope hanging down the chimney. He gives her the location of the treasure. John escapes and makes it to the moat where the sweep is waiting to take him away. Finally, John arrives at the ship where Alice and the treasure are waiting to sail to France. Richard has Mord take his nephews to the Bloody Tower. Young Edward is deposed as king by old Richard. Mord comes into the room of the 2 royals, and he and his henchmen murder the 2 boys. Old Richard moves his doll to the throne. In France, Alice and John present Henry Tudor with the gold. When Richard says there will be war, Mord begs to come along. Henry Tudor and his army arrive in England. The 2 armies meet at Bodsworth. Mord does well in battle, fighting like he's 10 men. Old Richard and Henry Tudor find each other on the battlefield. But this time, Richard is struck down. Mord flees the battle with John in pursuit. John stabs Mord with a sword, and he falls down the hill. They unceremoniously drag old Richard's body away. Alice and John are married under the watchful eye of Elizabeth.
Here's the world-famous short summary.
Couple has a few bumps before they can wed. If you enjoyed this week's show, please tell your friends, and if you really want to help, drop over to iTunes to give me a review. If you want to comment, recommend a movie, or just say hi, follow the links in the show notes to my site. Beware the Moors.
Let's be frank. You never wanted to give me a review on iTunes. You come to me this day, on the day of my daughter's wedding, and you ask me, give me a movie review. But you never come to my house in friendship. You never wanted to drink coffee with me. Had you gone to iTunes and given me a review, this day I would give you a movie review.